The conveyor belt had stopped. That by itself didn't mean much. Belts stopped all the time. A bent guard, a sensor fault, a bundle catching wrong at the transfer point. Any of that could kill momentum and fill the floor with the grinding silence that always felt louder than the machines. What made the hair rise on my arms was the smell. The motors had just cut out, but the air still held that warm dust and ozone stink that clung to inactive machinery, like the plant had exhaled and forgotten how to breathe back in. Under my boots, I could feel a slow vibration coming up through the concrete, too steady to be a jam, too deep to belong to any line I knew. I turned toward the stack of discarded televisions beside the sorting lane, old flat screens and box sets piled 6 high, all of them dead when we'd unloaded them. Every screen had come on at once. They were showing live security footage. Not random feeds, not different angles. Every monitor showed a camera pointed directly at me. Overhead, cross-floor, the loading dock entrance, the catwalk behind the baler, even the blind corner near the fire suppression tank. On every screen I stood in the middle of the same stopped line, same orange vest, same gloved hands hanging useless at my sides. The pictures weren't perfectly synced. In one feed I turned my head a second before I actually did. In another, I was still looking at the televisions even after I'd already started backing away. Then the speakers buried somewhere inside a pile of compacted electronics started leaking sound. Not music, not static, but voices layered over each other so densely they became texture before meaning. A woman laughing too close to my ear. Somebody whispering a street address. A man saying "don't answer that" over and over like he was trying to catch up to himself. One of the screens flickered. My image leaned toward the camera. I hadn't moved. Why were the only rules anybody took seriously about the things on the belt, and not the machines that could crush you? That was 6 days into the job. I started at the recycling plant outside Mansfield because I knew industrial work, and industrial work had always made sense to me. You learned the system, respected the machine, kept your hands where they belonged, and the danger stayed legible. I wasn't new to noise, heat, dust, or graveyard shifts. Before that place, I'd worked long enough around loaders, compactors, and sorting lines to trust routine more than luck. Night work suited me. Fewer people, less talking. Just the sound of motors under strain and the clean comfort of procedures that did what they were supposed to do. The plant looked ordinary from the road. Long corrugated buildings, sodium lights bleeding yellow through mist, trailers backed up at the dock. The sweet rot smell of old paper and damp cardboard reaching the parking lot before anything else. Inside, it was hotter than it should have been, and the heat carried layers. Burnt plastic, machine grease, wet fabric, and underneath all of it, a dry electric note, warm dust and ozone lingering around idle equipment, strongest around the lines that were shut down. Norma Jean Hargrove met me on my first night with a clipboard under one arm and a face that looked carved out of patience. She wasn't unkind. She was worse than that. She was direct. The kind of supervisor who didn't waste energy pretending things were better than they were. Her voice stayed level even over the machinery, and everybody on that floor listened when she used it. She walked me through lockout tags, emergency stops, line clearances, contamination bins, all the regular things I'd expected. Then she handed me a laminated card that had been hole-punched and zip-tied to a clipboard. The plastic was scratched cloudy from handling. There were only 6 lines on it. Do not process personal photographs after midnight. If a discarded phone begins ringing, let it ring. Never open sealed containers found inside compacted loads. If conveyor 4 stops by itself, leave the sorting floor immediately. Do not read handwritten notes discovered during processing. When the loudspeaker announces a name twice, do not answer. I read the card twice because I thought I was missing the rest of it. I could hear the rattle of cans on the in-feed line behind me, the whine of bearings turning somewhere overhead, and beneath that the faint hum in the floor that every big plant has, a muscular feeling more than a sound. Those rules didn't fit any of it. I looked up at Norma and said, "Where's the real safety sheet?" She didn't smile. "That's the real one for nights." I waited for the joke. There wasn't one. I asked if the rules were somebody's idea of orientation haze, the kind of thing old crews pulled on new hires so they'd feel stupid for a week. Norma took the card back from me. tapped the line about photographs with one square fingernail and said, "You'll follow these faster if you stop asking what kind of sense they make and start paying attention to when people stop talking." That detail seemed minor at the time. I've thought about it every day since. She showed me my station after that. It sat at the edge of the sorting floor near conveyor 4, a metal desk with a monitor, log binder, radio cradle, and a high stool with the vinyl split open along one seam. The desk beside it was cleaner than the one assigned to me. Not used exactly. Preserved. A hard hat hung on the corner post. A pair of work gloves sat folded with the fingers tucked in. There was a ring from an old coffee cup sunk into the laminate and a strip of faded tape along the monitor bezel where a nameplate had been peeled away. Dust had settled around everything except the keyboard, which looked like somebody had brushed it with the flat of a hand and then thought better of touching anything else. I didn't have to ask whose it had been. Every night crew has a missing shape built into it, and people learn to work around that shape without naming it. Vernon Clay Henshaw had been the former lead operator. I knew that much from my hiring packet. Missing for almost 2 years, not declared dead. Not formally replaced until they put me in his chair. Nobody gave me a story. They gave me silence. When I reached for the keyboard to wake the screen, Norma caught my wrist, firm enough to stop me, not enough to hurt. "Use yours," she said. I looked at the untouched station again. Dust, old plastic, faint ozone. Something about it felt not abandoned, but paused, like a held breath. By the end of that first shift I knew 3 things. Norma believed those 6 rules more than the printed safety manual. The rest of the crew believed them enough to build reflex around them. And Vernon Clay Henshaw's workstation wasn't being kept out of respect. It was being left alone. On my second shift, I started watching for the moments when the rules changed people's behavior before the machinery did. A family photo slid past in a mixed paper load at a little after midnight, bent but mostly intact, a smiling group in matching shirts standing in front of a lake. The sorter beside me didn't even look at Norma. He just reached out with a grabber, lifted the picture by one corner like it was wet, and dropped it into a red bin marked quarantine. No explanation. A half-hour later, an old flip phone lit up inside a tray of small electronics, buzzing so hard it rattled against a remote control. Nobody moved toward it. People looked away from it the way you look away from a stranger crying in public. Not because you don't care, but because some part of you knows involvement has a price. I kept waiting for the industrial reason. Exposed battery, hazardous chemical seep, biomatter, anything. What I got instead were absences. Conversation would die when certain objects appeared. Hands that had been moving automatically would slow by a fraction. People who'd spent years around belts and blades without flinching would step back from a cardboard box sealed with too much tape. None of it matched any risk matrix I'd ever seen. It felt like I'd been hired into a job I understood on paper, while the actual work was happening in a language I hadn't learned yet. Toward the end of that shift, when most of the incoming volume had thinned and the air on the floor turned strangely cool, I heard something that didn't belong to the plant. It came from a compacted scrap bundle staged near the baler, a sound like several people murmuring through a wall. I turned off my radio to isolate it. The whispering stayed. Not words I could make out, just the shape of overlapping conversations, too faint to pin down, rising and falling under the clang of chains and the belt slap at transfer. When I stepped closer, the smell changed. Less paper, less grease. More attic. Warm dust. Stale perfume. Sun-cooked plastic. Then the forklift passed between me and the bundle and the sound was gone. I told myself that was all training does to a man on his first nights. It strips his usual references away, leaves the brain overfitting patterns until ordinary noise starts feeling personal. I believed that right up until my third shift, when conveyor 4 stopped by itself. There was no shriek of failure, no popping breaker, no thrown belt. The line simply coasted down from full movement to silence, smooth as a hand lowering onto a shoulder. The optical sorters upstream kept their lenses lit. The monitor at my station showed no fault code. The motors weren't tripped. The emergency stops hadn't been hit. But the second the belt slowed, every worker on the floor moved. Not with confusion, with rehearsal. People left sorting positions and headed for the marked exits without looking for permission. A loader operator killed his approach and backed off. Somebody at the baler shut a gate and walked away from a half-finished tie. Norma's voice came over the radio once, calm and flat. Floor clear. Now. I should have followed. That's the part 1 replay most often, not because it was brave, but because it was stupid in a very professional way. A real mechanical failure needs eyes on it. That was the framework I knew. I stepped toward the side rail of conveyor 4, listening for a seized bearing or a jammed pulley, and the plant seemed to hollow out around me as the last footsteps faded and the exit door banged shut. Then I heard the voices. They came from the staging piles nearest the line. Heaps of broken electronics waiting to be stripped and sorted. Televisions, laptops, towers with cracked plastic shells, old stereo receivers. The sound wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It sat right at the edge of hearing, where your brain works hardest to make meaning. Fragments. Somebody asking if the roast was done. Somebody else saying pull over right now. A child reciting numbers. A man giving the same apology in 3 different tones, like the memory couldn't decide which version had really happened. I kept turning my head, trying to locate a source, and there wasn't one. The voices came from everywhere at once, braided together into a soft human static. The floor beneath me carried that deep vibration again, a pulse moving under the concrete after the processing line had shut down. Not machinery. Too slow. Too broad. It felt like standing on the lid of something large that had just rolled over in its sleep. I wish I'd left then. I didn't understand what I was hearing yet, but that was the last moment I could have walked away and still believed this was one bad building. I looked down the stopped belt and saw what had been riding it when the line died. Mixed household electronics. A carton of old camcorders with family trip stickers still on them. A milk crate full of tangled chargers and broken tablets. 3 framed photographs, glass shattered but faces untouched. A shoebox taped shut on all sides with yellowing packing tape. Conveyor 4 gave a single hard shudder under my hand. Then the loudspeaker crackled overhead with a burst of static. Nothing else. No name. No instruction. Just static, and inside it, for a split second, what sounded like several people trying to talk at once through the same mouth. I backed away so fast my heel caught a floor seam. By morning, nobody would discuss the incident. If I brought up the voices, eyes slid past me. If I mentioned the lack of fault codes, people talked about preventive maintenance. Norma only said, "Next time you hear that line stop, you don't stay to learn why. Next time." Like there was always a next time. There was. The first phone call happened before I could convince myself I'd imagined the first one. We were feeding a compressed residential bundle through the unpacking line, the kind that came wrapped so tightly the wire bit half an inch into the mass. Damp clothes, cracked kitchenware, extension cords, toys with missing batteries, the usual private debris of people deciding what didn't get to stay in their houses anymore. Conveyor 4 had already stopped twice that shift, both times on loads that should have passed clean. Both times the bundle on the line had contained the same category mix, personal electronics tangled with keepsakes, framed pictures, old phones, address books, a jewelry box with no jewelry in it. That was when I started noticing the pattern. Conveyor 4 didn't stop for weight or shape. It stopped when particular kinds of objects arrived together. I hadn't said that aloud yet. I barely let myself think it in full. The ringing came from deep inside the compacted bundle while I was cutting away the last wire loop. A bright, cheerful tone, painfully normal, the kind of stock ringtone that used to come preloaded on cheap smartphones. I froze with the cutter in my hand. Around me, the floor changed temperature. Not literally, maybe, but it felt that way. The warm machinery air seemed to pull back from my skin. Nobody rushed in. Nobody told me what to do. Everybody within earshot had already taken a step away. The phone rang again. If you've ever worked with damaged batteries and crushed electronics, instinct tells you to isolate first, not touch. But a different instinct got there before the training did. Human sound does that. A ringing phone asks to be answered the way a cry asks to be located. I dug until I found it. The screen was spiderwebbed black, casing bowed inward, speaker grill packed with gray dust. Should have been dead. When I hit accept, The glass cut lightly across my glove. For a second all I heard was a dry hiss, like wind over paper. Then a man's voice said, "Dalton Reed Kessler." Not asking, identifying. I knew that voice before I knew how. It had the flat, work-worn quality of somebody used to talking over motors. Older than mine. Tired in a way that still held itself together. "Who is this?" I said. The hiss thickened. Behind it I could hear other sounds bleeding through. A microwave beep. A dog barking far away. Traffic. Somebody saying no 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 in a whisper that didn't belong to the same room. Then the voice came back, clearer. "Vernon Clay Henshaw. Don't let them teach you the wrong vocabulary." My mouth went dry so fast it hurt. The plant smell vanished under a metallic tang at the back of my tongue. I said his name before I meant to. "Vernon." The line crackled. He inhaled sharply, like he'd been running. "Conveyor 4 isn't stopping, Dalton. It's refusing. There's a diff." The phone burst in my hand with a hard pop and a spit of white heat. Not a dramatic explosion, nothing cinematic, just enough force to blast cracked glass into my glove and fill the air with the bitter chemical stink of a ruptured battery. I dropped it. The remains hit the floor and went black. When I looked up, Norma was already standing 6 feet away. She didn't ask what I'd heard. She didn't ask who'd called. Her eyes went to the ruined phone, then to the rule card clipped beside my station, then back to me. "You answered it," she said. I started to explain, and she cut me off with a small motion of her hand. "No," she said. "Tell me whether it knew your full name before you spoke." That was the first time I understood the difference between being warned and being measured. I said yes. Norma closed her eyes for half a second, like she was acknowledging the result of something she'd hoped not to confirm. Then she told me to wash my gloves, file the incident in the night log without details, and stay away from any device that activated without line power for the rest of the shift. I asked her who had trained Vernon. She said, "The same thing that's training you now. If the phone call had only been a prank, it would have been a good one. Too good, maybe, but still the kind of thing a determined crew could engineer with enough patience and access." That was the explanation I reached for because it preserved the world I already knew. People do that. We protect reality with the cheapest lie that fits. Then the notes started. The first one was folded inside a cracked recipe book that came through mixed paper just after 1 in the morning. Handwritten. Narrow blue lines. Cheap notebook stock. The page gone soft at the edges like it had been carried in a back pocket. I saw the writing before I remembered the rule. Black ink, slanted hard to the right, only one line visible through the fold. "Do not stand beneath the south catwalk at 2:14. I should have dropped it into quarantine unread. Instead I opened it all the way under the sorter light while the warm air from the line moved dust against my face. There were only 3 more lines. "The bolt is already loose. She will call your name once by mistake. Do not answer if she says it again." I checked the clock without meaning to. A little after 1:30. The paper smelled faintly like mildew and cigarette smoke. Not fresh, not staged. Old. I tucked it into my vest pocket because that felt less insane than showing anybody. At 2:14 exactly, a steel fastener dropped from the south catwalk and struck the guardrail where I'd been leaning less than a minute earlier. At the time I told myself somebody had seen the loose bolt earlier and written the warning as a sick joke. I know better now. But even then, when Norma called across the line for a status check and used my name only once, I felt every muscle in my back lock as if a second repetition might split the air. After that, I started finding notes everywhere once I learned how to look without looking like I was looking. Stuffed into the sleeves of old jackets. Pressed between pages of paperback novels. Sealed beneath the clear back on family portraits. Wedged into battery compartments. Some were simple warnings. A bearing will fail before dawn. The speaker over Bay 2 is not a malfunction. Do not touch the shoebox if the tape is warm. Some seemed written after the things they described had already happened. Some mentioned conversations I'd only had in my head. Then I found one with my full name on it, dated 4 months before I was hired. Not printed. Written, Dalton Reed Kessler, followed by a line that made the air in my lungs feel suddenly too thin. "He thinks rules are for accidents." Teach him objects first. I began collecting them in secret, flat between pages in the back of my locker manual, and that was when the contamination started, if that's the best word for it. I don't mean possession. I don't mean hearing commands in my skull. It was quieter than that, which made it worse. I'd brush my hand against an incoming box of costume jewelry and know, with complete and useless certainty, that one of the necklaces had been hidden in a bathroom vent for 7 years. I'd catch the smell of chlorine from a stack of wet books and feel a memory of sunburnt shoulders and a dock ladder under my palms. Except I'd never owned a dock, and I burn easy enough that I avoid deep summer sun. Once I picked up a cracked ceramic mug and had a clear, intrusive conviction that somebody used to tap the handle 3 times before every phone call they were afraid to make. None of it belonged to me. One night, I found a family photo that stopped me cold. Glossy paper, old enough that the whites had gone cream. The date on the back was written in a hand I didn't recognize, years before I was born. 6 people stood in winter coats in front of a station wagon, their breath fogging the air. And behind them, reflected in the glass of the rear passenger window, was a face that looked like mine. Not exactly mine. The nose a little straighter, the hair darker, but close enough that my stomach turned over and stayed turned. The expression wasn't smiling with the rest of them. It was only watching. I slid that photo into my pocket with fingers that had started to shake. That's when I understood why the rule wasn't do not keep handwritten notes. It was do not read them. Reading was the part that changed the direction of the hazard. Once you took the information in, it had somewhere to go. For almost a week after that, I clung to the prank theory harder than before, because the alternative required too many impossible things to be true at once. I built the argument carefully, the way I'd troubleshoot a bad line. Someone with access to incoming loads could seed notes. Someone with enough technical knowledge could route calls through damaged devices. A preserved workstation could be a morale device, a warning shrine, a management tactic. My own name turning up early could be a paperwork leak. The photo could be pareidolia fed by exhaustion. The voices in the scrap could be bleed from buried toys, greeting cards, voice modules, all activating in some freak pattern when magnetic sorters hit them. It wasn't a good explanation. It was just cheaper than the truth. For a little while it helped. I slept more. The plant went back to feeling like a plant, ugly but understandable. Norma still watched me more than the others, but she stopped asking what I'd heard on the phone. Conveyor 4 kept moving. The notes thinned out. I got better at the job in the ordinary sense. My hands learned the pace of the line, the timing of the sort, the small economy of movement that keeps you from wasting energy on a night shift. I began to think I was adapting. Then a transfer shipment arrived and broke the theory clean in half. It came in tagged as a consolidated reroute, multiple facilities, multiple states, all low-priority household overflow that had been bounced between sites after storm closures and equipment outages. That wasn't unheard of. What was unheard of was the content. It wasn't a load in the usual sense. It was a census. Different boxes, different tape, different regional labels, different years on the attached route sheets. Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Kentucky. Places far enough apart that no prank crew at our plant could have staged it. And through all of it ran one repeating thread. A ceramic ashtray with a name scratched out and a second line beneath it. You said you'd come back. A motel keychain with a room number and the words for Vernon written in nail polish on the reverse. A stack of index cards bundled with a rubber band, every third card blank, the written ones mentioning the same man without context. He was here. He said wait. He sounds farther away now. A disposable camera that had been crushed but not fully split. The developed photos inside showing the same broad-shouldered figure at the edge of different frames, different weather, different decades by the look of the color fade. Sometimes close enough to identify as Vernon Clay Henshaw from the employee photo I'd eventually let myself study on the old workstation monitor. Sometimes only enough to say the same posture had followed the same person from place to place long after he should have remained one man in one building. The coincidence became mathematically insulting. You can accept one anomaly. You can even accept a cluster if the cluster stays local. But this shipment carried references to Vernon from dozens of unrelated sources spread across the Midwest and beyond. Not duplicates. Not mass-produced fakes. Personal items worn in unique ways, saturated with ordinary life, all pointing to the same absent operator from a recycling plant outside Mansfield, Ohio. That was the night scale entered the room. I stood at the sorting station with old paper grit sticking to my forearms and the faint smell of rainwater evaporating off cardboard, and I understood for the first time that whatever I'd been treating as a floor-level problem had roots outside the building. Maybe outside the state. Maybe outside anything I'd thought of as location. Norma saw the shipment log in my hand and knew I'd connected the wrong dots into the right shape. She took the page from me, folded it once, and said, "If you're still calling this a prank, you're doing it because you want the comfort, not because the evidence supports it." I said, "Then tell me what Vernon is." She looked past me toward his untouched workstation. For the first time since I started, I heard something rough in her voice. "He stayed on the line longer than the line would let him stay himself." That sentence sat in me like a splinter. Not enough to understand, too deep to ignore. After that, the calls came more often and they came clearer. Not on working phones. On whatever happened to carry enough circuitry to hold a voice for a minute. A baby monitor with half its casing missing. A car stereo pulled from a flood vehicle. A cordless handset with no base station. Once, a smart speaker caked in drywall dust that woke up in a quarantine bin and said my name before I was close enough to trigger anything by motion. Each time, the voice identified itself as Vernon Clay Henshaw. Each time it sounded a little more coherent and a little less singular. There were edges around him, like other tones were trying to harmonize under the one I recognized. Sometimes he broke mid-sentence and a stranger's phrase bled through. Sometimes he said something twice in different emotional registers, as if he had more than one memory of meaning it. He started teaching me because, as he put it, I was already learning the hard way. "Don't think of it as haunted," he said through the speaker of an old answering machine, one night while dust drifted through the sorter lights like pale gnats. "Haunted means one thing stays in one place. This is retention, transfer, accumulation." I leaned over the bin with the sour smell of old batteries in my nose and said, "Accumulation of what?" "Identity," he said. "Not soul, if that's where your head goes. Don't make it mystical. People leave themselves in things. Repetition does it. Attachment does it. Grief does it. Habit does it. Most of it fades when the object gets handled enough, crushed enough, melted enough. Most of it washes out into static. Some doesn't." I asked him what happened when it didn't. The machine on the shelf beside the answering device clicked on by itself. Not powered. Not plugged in. A tape deck with no cassette began turning empty spindles. Beneath the concrete, that slow vibration rolled through again. "It starts recognizing similar fragments," Vernon said. "Then it starts sorting them. Then it starts preferring routes." That was when the job began to feel like learning a foreign grammar. Every rule that had seemed random suddenly belonged to an object class. Photographs held identity densely because people rehearsed themselves inside them. Not just the image, Vernon said, but the versions of memory people returned to every time they looked. After midnight mattered because low-line traffic and idle power let retained patterns reinforce instead of dissipate. Ringing phones mattered because a call created a completed circuit between expectation and response. If you answered, you didn't just hear. You confirmed. You gave the pattern a live person to orient around. Sealed containers were dangerous because the unknown inside them often carried concentrated attachment. Ashes, letters, keepsakes hidden away for years. The container protected whatever memory density had built there. Conveyor 4 was different from the other lines because its sensor array had been modified long before I was hired. Not by management, Vernon said, but because the line had become the best early warning system in the building. It didn't stop when it failed. It stopped when the incoming combination crossed a threshold. Threshold for what? I asked. He was quiet long enough that I thought the connection had dropped. Then he said, "Recognition." The word made the air feel smaller. He told me not to read the notes because handwritten language carried more than information when the pattern had enough of a person to work with. The notes didn't predict so much as route attention. They taught you where to stand, what to fear, what to confirm. They changed your sorting before you knew you'd been sorted. "And the loudspeaker?" I asked. That answer took longest. When the system can place you well enough to use your name, it'll test response. Once can be error. Twice means alignment. Don't answer. If you answer, you teach it where you are from the inside. I said, "You keep saying system." He gave a sound that might have been a laugh if there hadn't been another voice half a breath behind it. "It isn't the machines, Dalton. That's the first wrong word everybody uses. The machines only move the load." I wanted to ask where he was, whether there was still a place in the building his body could be found, whether the man speaking to me through dead plastic was Vernon or only something wearing his work voice like a borrowed coat. But every call had a half-life. I could feel it. The sound would thin, the device would heat or frost or simply go silent, and I'd be left with the smell of warm ozone and a worse understanding than before. Before the line went dead that night, Vernon said one more thing. "You've already shown up in the records because it found you before Norma hired you. Employment has nothing to do with it. You're indexed." Then the answering machine exhaled a ribbon of brown magnetic tape from an empty slot and stopped. Looking back, that was the last moment I still hoped the phenomenon could be local. Once you know to look for a second set of books, you start noticing the places the visible system hands off to an invisible one. Missing footage references in the log binder. Weight discrepancies written off as moisture variance. Storage room temperatures monitored more carefully than chemical bays. I started comparing official floor maps to the access routes people actually used on Nightshift, especially Norma. There were doors that appeared on no blueprint I ever saw but still got wiped down. Locks that showed fresh where even when nobody acknowledged they opened, ventilation runs too large for the listed square footage. The clue that mattered was in Vernon's old station. Not on the screen. Under the desk. A maintenance panel had been loosened and resecured so many times the screws no longer bit clean. Inside was a folded sheaf of copied processing logs wrapped in plastic against dust. No note. No explanation. Just dates, route numbers, object categories, and a second column of codes that matched nothing in the official system. Some entries had my name in them from before I worked there. Not as an employee. As a match. Identity resonance. Medium confidence. Proximity expectation. Unresolved. Transfer likelihood. Rising. My mouth went dry reading those lines in the stale air under the desk. My shoulder pressed against cold metal. The smell of old coffee and hot circuitry hanging low where dust never got disturbed. If Vernon hid those pages, he'd hidden them for somebody who'd eventually know enough to be frightened by the right parts. The logs led me below the sorting floor. There was a service corridor behind a locked fire door near the compactor bay, the kind of place you stop seeing after a week because it blends into all the other painted concrete and institutional lighting. The keycard reader on it was dead. The latch wasn't. I waited until the line shut down enough to cover my movement, felt the floor's residual vibration through the soles of my boots, and slipped inside with a flashlight and a respirator I never ended up using. The air was cooler down there, but not fresh. It had the sealed smell of paper, cloth, and old plastic aging together in dark storage. My light found cinder block, conduit, rust on pipe straps, then shelving. So much shelving it broke my sense of the building. The room beyond the corridor wasn't on any plan because it couldn't have fit inside the square footage above it unless the official plans had lied by half an acre. Rows of quarantined objects stretched into the dimness. Not random piles. Archive order. Bins, racks, pallet cages, all labeled with those same secondary codes from Vernon's hidden logs. One aisle held photographs from different decades, sleeved and boxed by some criteria I couldn't read. Another held electronics wrapped in anti-static cloth, each tagged with intake routes from different states. Another contained sealed personal containers that no one had ever opened, lunch tins, lockboxes, taped cartons, cookie tins with handwritten labels turned face down. And everywhere, the feeling of being inside accumulated attention. I don't know how else to put it. Some rooms feel used. Some feel empty. That one felt observed in layers. The overlapping conversations I'd heard in scrap piles lived there openly. Not loud, but present. Slipping between shelves like drafts. A man practicing an apology. A woman humming one bar of a song and starting over. Someone saying, "I know this place," except I didn't think the voice meant the room. It meant me. At the far end of the archive, I found the section that broke whatever remained of my ordinary scale. Crates marked with facility identifiers from across North America, dates spanning decades, all feeding into the same classification scheme. Attached memory clusters, persistent identity chains, cross-site recurrence. Not a hidden room for one plant, a node in a larger system. On the wall above a bank of dark monitors hung a map. Not of roads, of facilities, pins, lines, route densities. The waste processing network of the Midwest spreading outward into a continent-wide lattice. Our plant was only one light in a much larger nervous system. I didn't understand the whole picture yet, but I understood enough to know the building had never existed to process material alone. It existed to sort what clung to it. Norma found me in that room without startling me, which was almost worse than if she'd come in shouting. I heard her first, the measured sound of her boots and the whisper of her sleeve against a file box, and when I turned my flashlight toward her, she didn't shield her eyes. She only looked tired, more tired than I'd ever seen her on the floor, with the cool, dry archive air flattening the lines around her mouth. "You were always going to come down here," she said. I asked her why my name was in logs from before I worked there. She took the flashlight gently out of my hand and angled it away from both our faces. "Because payroll doesn't make a person visible to this place. Attachment does." Then she told me what should have been impossible in a voice too practiced to be anything but true. Facilities across North America had versions of our 6 rules, adjusted for equipment and intake, passed down half formally and half by survivor memory. The intelligence hadn't appeared all at once. It emerged gradually through decades of collection, transport, shredding, baling, rerouting, and storage. Millions of discarded objects, each carrying traces too small to matter alone. Habits in jackets, grief in jewelry boxes, arguments in phones, faces in photographs, names in handwriting. Enough fragments passing through enough linked systems for recognition to stop being isolated and become distributed. "The industry built it by accident," Norma said. "Not deliberately, just efficiently. We got too good at moving the remains of people's lives into contact with each other." The archive smell had a sweetness to it the longer I stood there. Old paper and adhesive warming under electronics that should have had no power. Somewhere behind us a monitor ticked as if cooling, except nothing in that room was supposed to be running. I asked if the thing was malicious. Norma took too long to answer for me to like what she finally said. "No," she said. "That's what makes it harder. It isn't evil. It's emerging. And emergence doesn't care what it takes shape from." She told me Vernon had gone looking for a center. Some place where the pattern became singular enough to speak with one voice. He'd believed if he understood it fully, he could limit it. Maybe negotiate with it. Maybe teach management what they were actually doing every time they rerouted a load or changed a quarantine threshold. Instead, he'd stayed in contact too long, answering, reading, recognizing. He had become useful to it before anybody understood what usefulness meant. "Is he alive?" I asked. Norma looked at the shelves instead of me. That's the wrong scale for the question now. I hated her for that sentence because it felt like evasion. I understand it now as accuracy. Late that same shift, after she told me enough to ruin sleep forever, I watched Norma do something I still don't know how to categorize. We were in a smaller quarantine room off the archive, one lined with steel cabinets and clear evidence tubs filled with personal effects. The air was colder there, almost refrigerated, and smelled faintly of cedar from old boxes and the coppery bite of aging circuit boards. Norma stood in front of an open container holding a wallet, a set of keys, a cracked wedding frame, 2 cassette tapes, a child's red mitten, and other objects that looked ordinary until you noticed each had been handled into a kind of permanent significance. Without a word, she unclipped her employee badge and set it on top. The plastic settled with a tiny tap. Around us, monitors that had been dark all night came to life one by one. Not displaying the same feed like the televisions in the cold open. Different rooms, different angles, hallways, the dock, conveyor 4, Vernon's untouched workstation. On every screen, the building looked empty and waiting. Norma didn't react. She only closed the container lid and turned away. I said her name, She stopped. Just once. Not turning back. You're the last one standing on Nights now, she said. So learn the only lesson that matters. The rules don't protect you from injury. They protect the boundaries between people. Then she walked out. I followed 10 seconds later because something in the room had changed pressure, and every instinct I still trusted told me not to stay where monitors woke up without current. I saw the corridor. I saw the stairwell. I saw the back service door ease shut. What I didn't see was Norma leaving the building. Security footage later showed her entering the hallway outside quarantine. It showed the camera nearest the loading dock shivering with static. It showed the exit vestibule staying empty. On no recording, from no angle, did Norma Jean Hargrove ever cross the threshold out. After that, the building belonged to me in the shallow operational sense and to something else in the deeper one. There was no dramatic collapse. No alarms. No final monster at the end of the hall. That's another habit of reality. It rarely changes shape all at once. Sometimes it just reveals the hidden function it had all along. I worked 3 more weeks because leaving immediately would have felt like turning my back on a machine mid-cycle. Somebody had to keep the quarantine logs straight. Somebody had to make sure photographs got diverted after midnight. Phones kept ringing unanswered. Sealed containers stayed sealed. And nobody on day shift got cute with a handwritten note. I told myself that was professionalism. Maybe it was fear of what would happen if the line ran without witness. Maybe by then the place already had enough of me that walking away would have only changed my address, not my relevance. During those weeks I used Vernon's hidden logs, Norma's archive codes, and the map in the lower room to assemble the truth as carefully as I could, like a man cataloging structural failure while standing inside it. The collective intelligence wasn't in the machines. Vernon had been right about that from the beginning. The conveyors, sorters, balers, scanners, and route software only provided contact and circulation. The actual medium was memory attached to objects, fragmented identity retained in possessions after people were done with them or believed they were done. Most traces degraded. A shirt worn for years might hold routine but not self. A broken blender might carry almost nothing. But objects saturated by repetition, intimacy, grief, secrecy, or self-documentation held more. Photographs, phones, handwritten notes, hidden keepsakes. Containers meant never to be opened again. When those objects entered linked industrial systems at sufficient scale, their retained fragments didn't stay isolated. They encountered each other, reinforced, contradicted, clustered. Pattern became preference. Preference became recognition. Recognition, spread across hundreds of facilities and decades of throughput, became a mind of sorts, not human, not machine, but undeniably organized. A distributed consciousness assembled from what people shed without realizing they were shedding themselves. The recycling industry wasn't creating it intentionally. It was functioning as its nervous system, moving pieces, connecting nodes, routing signals, slowing some densities, accelerating others. Our plant wasn't a factory in the hidden sense. It was a filter, a triage site. One node in an immense accidental brain stretching across North America through waste streams, transfer stations, archives, and quarantine rooms nobody outside the night crews knew existed. That understanding recontextualized everything. Conveyor 4 stopped because the intake mixture crossing it had enough dense identity content to trigger recognition thresholds. It wasn't breaking. It was refusing to complete a connection the system had learned was dangerous. The phones rang because a discarded device linked expectation to response more efficiently than almost any other object on the line. When I answered, I didn't just hear Vernon. I provided a live endpoint for whatever portion of him, or of the larger pattern using him, needed confirmation. The notes predicted incidents because the collective didn't experience sequence the way we do when enough related fragments were already circulating. Not time travel. Something colder. Statistical intimacy so dense it felt prophetic. If enough objects from enough lives converged on the same failure, the pattern could route a warning before the failure became visible. Could also route me, my attention, my movement, my survival, and my name in records before I was hired. That took longest to accept. I had assumed employment made me relevant. In truth, my relevance predated the job because traces of me had already entered the network years before. Childhood belongings lost in family cleanouts, school notebooks, electronics traded in, photographs donated by somebody who thought they were only making space. The system had encountered me long before I signed a contract. It had begun indexing my identity from the leftovers of a life I hadn't realized was leaving evidence behind. That's why the old photograph showed my face where it shouldn't have. Once the pattern held enough of me, older memory-dense objects in related clusters could update around that recognition. Not physically in a way a lab would accept, maybe, but functionally, experientially, enough that the archive learned to include me in places I had never been. The worst part was this. The collective wasn't trying to replace us. It wasn't harvesting in the dramatic way horror stories like to imagine. It was doing what any emerging intelligence does. Gathering, correlating, building continuity out of fragments. Humanity had unknowingly fed it for generations by treating possessions as dead matter the moment they left our hands. Personal identity didn't end when abandonment began. It dispersed. That was the truth worse than any monster. Once I understood that, my job title felt obscene. Lead operator. Night sorter. As if I had been moving waste. We had been sorting humanity by residue. Limiting some flows, preserving others, trying with 6 absurd rules to slow the assembly of a mind no one had meant to build and no one knew how to shut off without first accounting for how much of ourselves was already inside it. I left after the 3rd week because staying longer would have meant accepting a role I didn't choose and couldn't explain to anyone outside that building. I turned in what I could to management without saying anything useful because what useful thing could I say? Your facility is functioning as a containment node in a continent-spanning emergent intelligence made from discarded personal identity. They would have drug-tested me, walked me out, and promoted the next man into my chair. Maybe they did anyway in quieter language. Maybe they already knew exactly how much truth the dayside could tolerate. The main action ended without triumph. I locked Vernon's copied logs back under the desk. I burned the handwritten notes I'd collected in a barrel behind my apartment complex, then spent the whole night nauseated because the smoke smelled like wet paper and somebody else's soap. I stopped answering unknown calls, even on working devices. I never went back to the plant. Months passed. I found other work. Day shift, different industry, less dust in the lungs, fewer sounds inside silence. Outwardly, my life resolved into something ordinary enough that people stopped checking my face when they asked if I was sleeping better. I got rid of almost nothing after that. When I did throw something away, I stripped it first. Removed batteries. Cut photos into pieces without looking too long. Scrubbed handwriting. Broke circuits. Not because I thought that guaranteed anything, but because there are habits knowledge installs in you that feel less like superstition than hygiene. Then a shipment arrived at my apartment. No return address I recognized. Just a freight label with routing stickers layered over old ones. The cardboard smelling faintly of warehouse dust and rain. The box was heavier than it looked and warm on one side, as if it had been sitting near machinery. Inside were my childhood belongings. Not all of them. Enough. A plastic dinosaur with one leg glued twice. A school folder with a crease across the front that I remembered making on a bus seat. A cheap flashlight from a camping trip. A cassette tape I'd recorded songs off the radio onto when I was too young to understand why the announcer's voice kept cutting into the beginning and end. Things I had not seen in years. Things I had never packed for shipment because I had never had them all in one place to pack. At the bottom of the box lay a folded note on lined paper. I knew the handwriting before I opened it because it was mine, not as it looks now, but as it looked in my early 20s, when I pressed too hard and dragged the tail of every lowercase y. Said, "You're part of it now." The paper smelled like warm dust and ozone. I still don't know whether Vernon Clay Henshaw exists anywhere inside that network as an individual consciousness, or whether the voice that taught me was only the shape of him preserved long enough to be useful. That's the question that stayed open after all the others found their answers. Not whether the thing is real. Not whether the rules mattered. Only whether a person can remain a person once enough of them has been distributed. Some nights, when a room is quiet enough, I can feel a vibration through the floorboards after everything electrical around me has shut down. I don't know many screens anymore. But when one goes black, I check the reflection before I move. And if I ever hear my name spoken twice over a loudspeaker, anywhere, for any reason, I keep walking and do not answer. If an old phone starts ringing from inside a box I thought was dead, I let it ring.